All right, cool. All right, well, let's kick off. So, welcome here this Saturday morning. Um, and so the talk, as you know, is on secularism and Buddhism. Um, so maybe as we kick off, how many people here would consider themselves secular?
Did you say secular?
Secular, yeah.
As opposed to something?
Well, would you? No, just interested. Who would think of themselves secular? I think there's a few hands. Half people. Who thinks themselves as religious?
That's what?
Religious.
Religious.
Oh, he almost put his hand up, but then put it down pretty quick. Okay, and who considers themselves something else? That's interesting. So over half something else. Okay, that's cool. All right, great. All right, well, look, let's spiritual. Yeah.
That's like a category.
Well, I think it is. Yeah, we'll talk more about that. I think as we get going. But hi. All right, cool. All right. Well, look, I think. It's interesting that even that answer at the beginning about, yes, another category of spiritual, because when I was doing the research for this talk, and you try and pin down what secularism is, and it's quite difficult really to define it in any sort of consistent way. That's why I was going to maybe talk about a little bit about what is secularism in the first place, and where did it come from. And then what I was going to do is more talk a little bit about secular Buddhism, as opposed to traditional Buddhism, and really sort of contrast the two and the underlying beliefs and values of secular Buddhism versus traditional Buddhism. And then also talk a little bit about, which maybe relates to what you're saying in terms of spirituality or meaning, isn't it? Meaning in life. What gives us meaning and purpose in life, and how does this sort of discussion inform that sort of topic. So for this one as well, as we go, we could probably take questions as we go through it and discuss some of the topics as they come up. You good?
Yeah.
You've been cycling a lot?
Only from home.
Okay. All right, cool. Okay, so maybe, and then one of the reasons why this came up, there's been a few people at our classes, raising the question of Buddhism and what are the beliefs, and a lot of people have read nowadays a lot of secular Buddhism about, maybe you don't need to believe in things like rebirth and karma and so on, and different takes on what Buddhism is. And so that came out of some requests then, to give a talk on secularism and Buddhism. So, and maybe as we kick off, maybe my own journey as well, maybe share a little bit about my own journey. So when I've been practicing Buddhism for over 30 years, but when I was young, a long time ago, and before university, I was very political at the time, but I was very firmly of the opinion when I was like 14 to 18, 19, being a Marxist. I don't know how many people follow Marxism, but if you're a real serious Marxist, it's already about dialectical. Well, the underlying metaphysics around dialectical materialism. So you understand the Hegelian dialectic, but then combining that with the belief that everything is matter. So essentially, that's what Marxism is based on in terms of why it's the next form of legitimate society and blah blah blah. They have this theory of dialectical materialism. So when I went to university, I sort of switched from I'd done physics and double mathematics, A level, and so on. But then I switched to philosophy, and part of my reasoning at the time, as sort of 18, 19-year-old, was that I wanted to learn Western philosophy. I wanted to understand Hegel, so I could better understand Das Kapital and Marx. So I did straight philosophy at university, mainly Western philosophy, starting with like pre-Socratics and Plato, Aristotle, and then modern philosophy like Descartes through Hume and Kant and Hegel, and so for the next few years, I was studying Western philosophy. And it's during that time, for me, I thought, well, there must be a Western philosophical justification for why everything is matter. And so I went to university thinking, I'll find that. And that's, so do your pre-Socratics and your Plato, and then you go modern philosophy, and then some of the modern stuff like philosophy of science and so on. And there wasn't any metaphysical basis, philosophical basis for justifying the belief that everything was matter, and which I thought was surprising at the time. And then at that time, one of my friends started practicing Tibetan Buddhism, so I was about 20 at the time, and I started reading Buddhist philosophy, and that's really what I thought, actually this is far more insightful, and to me resonates as a lot more true than Western philosophy. And so I sort of flipped or changed my worldview and understanding of the world quite radically, from being a very firm materialist, everything's just matter, including mind, just a material process, to then going in with full-on Buddhism. And so the last sort of 30 plus years, I've just really dedicated myself to Tibetan Buddhism and so on. So in a way, that my own journey then sort of reflects this, having a very sort of secular view when I was growing up and so on, and then practicing Buddhism. So that's my sort of background in a way. So maybe as we kick off, though, maybe we should talk a little bit about secularism itself, and so secularism. And it's funny because I was just asked just before, what is secularism? And it's funny actually. I thought everyone would know what it was meant by it, but then even when I was doing research on it, it wasn't actually that clear. So the dictionary definition of secularism is the principle of separation of the state from religious institutions. So that's the technical definition. And if I did check AI a bit to get a more comprehensive definition, it said, secularism is the principle of separating religion from state affairs, advocating for a public sphere that is neutral, rational, and free from religious influence. It ensures that equal rights for all citizens, regardless of belief, protecting both freedom of religion and freedom from religion, rather than just opposing faith. So that was the definition from Gemini AI. I didn't check all the others. But that was, I thought, quite interesting. Now, I won't go into a detailed history of secularism, but maybe I'll cover some broad outlines, I think, of where it came from, and then how it manifested more recently in our society. But in some ways, this impulse, to separate church from state, there was a bit of an evolution, I guess, of that view coming into effect. More recent history, I guess, is the Enlightenment period, and some of these philosophers like Hume and Locke and Voltaire and others really advocating for it. But I'd say the history of it really comes earlier than that, really, particularly with the Reformation and Luther and Calvin. So that's really, I think, where it really started. So this radical, with the rise of Protestantism, I can't even say it, and the rejection of the traditional Catholic Church, partly because of all, a lot of the corruption and so on in the Church at the time, and the real rebellion against the institutions, I guess, that the Church represented. There's a radical sort of pushback against that, and then particularly with Luther, this different understanding of what Christianity was. So rejection of the whole hierarchy of the God, and then Jesus and the angels, and then the priests as the authority for God on earth, who you consult with. And so Luther sort of blew that whole paradigm up of, in a way, a society that had been existing for 1600 plus years, of everyone sort of knew their place in that cosmic order of the world, which is, I'm here and I talk to my priests and I pray to my saints and and that you pray to the saints primarily and Mary and so on. And then with Luther and the Protestant schools that followed from that, then it was this direct relationship to God. But in a way, it was sort of atomized, you might say, as society. This because suddenly everyone had their own legitimate, direct relationship with God and their own belief on what God is about, and belief in a way about what the idea that the personal belief is so important. In a way, stems, I'd argue, from the Reformation. Anyway, that's one trend, and I guess then later thinkers and the development of Renaissance, but then the Enlightenment period, there's this rise of reason as in a way as an opposing force to blind faith, I guess. So a big theme behind the rise of secularism was partly, with also the Protestant publication of the Bible and everyone more, having their own views on important matters like what's the nature of God and the rest of it. The rise of the individual opinion on everything was sort of started, and then through the Age of Reason, with Descartes and some of the other modern philosophers, there was this sort of rise of using reason. Initially, some people arguing against belief in a God and a creator God, others using it to try and use reason to justify the true existence of God, like Descartes and Kant and others. But there was this sort of rise of this, in a way, the what do you call it? The Renaissance man, someone, the rise of the intellectual, using reason and therefore worthy of respect and their opinions on the nature of reality and the world. There's this also underlying theme for many hundred years of rebellion against the corruption in the church and so on. And then in a way, 18th, 19th, and then more galvanized in the beginning of the 20th century, more explicit encoding of separation of state from the church. So that's a very rough and bad history, but roughly those are the sort of the ties. So I would say secularism is a rise against traditional Christianity, because I think it's really important to remember the context is we're all Westerners, nearly all, not all of us, but nearly all Westerners here, and so that's the context of secularism. And what I was certainly brought up in was a lot of the assumptions in that paradigm, I guess. And two of those main characteristics, I would say, skepticism towards religious dogma and superstition, taking things on blind faith. There's a notion, reason, logical reason's more important. We shouldn't just blindly accept things. Another key theme, I would say, is that through reason, we can form true opinions around morality and our understanding of the universe, understanding of what is real and what is true. So, rejection of superstition and the use of reason to get confidence in morality and meaning, I guess, in life and what things are about. So I guess that's what I'd summarise in a way what secularism is, sort of those two themes. And from a Buddhist perspective, a traditional Buddhist, I think that's pretty compatible with Buddhism, I'd say. So in Buddhism, Lord Buddha was very explicit on we should not take things on blind faith, but we should use reason and examine the truth of things. So the analogy he gave was of a gold merchant. So if you're a gold merchant, someone tries to sell some gold, you don't just believe it, you test, is it really gold? And you must test on it and, okay, you substantiate it's gold. But you shouldn't just take things on blind faith as well. And that goes from a Buddhist perspective on all these questions about the nature of reality or the nature of good and bad and right from wrong and so on. So that's and then similarly with morality as well, in the notions, teachings on karma, which we'll talk more about. Again, they're based on observation and reason, rather than blind faith that this is good and the bad because the Buddha said. So Buddhism is very different from. I guess one of the things I'm trying to say is Buddhism is very different from the Christian paradigm, which in a way secularism was a rejection of. Because in Christianity, typically, we believe, like, the Ten Commandments are right for wrong because God said this is the case. And why do you follow good from bad? And the Ten Commandments is because if you follow it, you'll go to heaven. If you don't, you go to hell. But you're being punished or rewarded by an omniscient God. So yeah, that's the simplicity. That's the basic paradigm. But from a Buddhist perspective and teachings on karma, for example, what's good and bad, there is no omnipotent God behind it. And they're not good and bad because God or a Buddha, like a God, said they're good and bad. It's all more about observation in the way the world works and the ways our mind works. And that's something we can critique and examine and get confidence in. And so the Buddhist path is very different. You follow the Buddhist path, and in a way, it's fine to have questions and question things, and then the path is in a way to examine the doubts and questions we have and get confidence in it through our practice and through examination and reason. Okay, so that's so Buddhism, we're pretty can get on board with some of those secular ideas, but one big difference is that secularism, which is partly why people often find it hard to say what it is that it doesn't offer a clear alternative to Christianity. So, in the Christian paradigm, where did the world come from? God created it. Why do I exist or seem to exist? Because you were created a soul. God created a soul within you and created you. So secularism doesn't say for sure there's definitely no God, and it doesn't say, instead of God, the world came about because of X, Y, Z. There's no coherent, secularism isn't therefore coherent opposition to Christianity. It just says, in a way, people can believe whatever they want, religion-wise, and somehow it's possible to run the government and society without having any religious beliefs. And then within that paradigm, individuals can then follow whatever religious beliefs they want. So it's quite a peculiar structure, which, by the way, never, secularism hasn't existed in any other parts of the world. It's very much a Western European invention, this whole paradigm. So a lot of us, like as Westerners, our whole way of thinking is very shaped by this quite peculiar separation of church and state that came about, between the 16th and 20th century Europe. So, and that I think affects a lot about how we approach spirituality or Eastern religions and so on. It's quite hard to think differently in a way from where we've come from. But the paradigm of secularism and versus say Buddhism, the backdrop of where they're coming from is very different places, even though there's some commonality. Any questions?
I just don't see how there's a difference. One's political, one's sort of personal.
You don't see how there's a difference between
I don't see why. Yeah.
Buddhism and secularism is yeah.
You can have both.
Well, we'll come to that. Yeah, maybe you can. So that's maybe at the end. Maybe we should go around and say at the end, can you be secular and Buddhist?
Ayatollah, all these regimes, these places would be craving for secularism. Just separate it.
I think that may be true. I would argue, or I will argue, maybe, that in the absence of secularism offering any clear metaphysics about what is it going on, and in the absence of any clear moral position, because it doesn't say there is a moral position, what generally happens in a secular society like ours is there's a lot of assumptions that have been taken from Christianity which are embedded in our political systems. So in fact, that was my next point actually, which I was going to come to that. Yeah, hold on, I thought. What was the guy said was exactly what you were coming from. So in a way, secularism, even though secularism pure says, religion, no opinion, but actually when we often think about a secular society, there's often a lot of things in there which are more Western values that come from our Christian background, which are just sort of assumed self-evident truths, really. So, for example, often, the paradigm is individual freedom and equal rights are valued in a secular society, and everyone should be treated equally as an individual, and you have the right to practice your religion, your right to live your life as you want. But in many ways, that value, you could argue, derives from the Christian notion of God creating everyone in His image, assuming you include women in that definition. But that notion of that's a very Christian value, that we should treat everyone equally as individual because we're all created by God. We all have a soul created by God. So that whole value of equal rights and the individual really comes from a Christian paradigm. That's why we often refer to it as a Western value, because it came from Western society. You could say, oh, well, about the ancient Greeks who created democracy. But if you look at democracy in ancient Greece, well, very few people actually could vote and were treated as citizens. So very small. Most people were slaves, and obviously women didn't have the vote. And so it's like, democracy was then built on from the ancient Greek paradigm, merged with the notion we're all equal under God, and then they sort of got what we've Western democracy in a way. So this sort of Christian Western mixed with Greek, ancient Greek sort of political systems sort of gets you, very broad brush, but it gets you Western modern democracy. There's another key thing that we talk a lot about in a secular society, which is progress. Generally we see, progress is good, and we want to be progressive. But why is progress good? And in what way is it good? And again, I'd argue maybe that this again stems from the Reformation. And after the Reformation, there was a tendency for millenarians and so on to believe that in a way, with the Protestant ethic, there will be a God on heaven on earth. And that we are building towards the end of history where there'll become a second coming of Christ and 1,000 years of heaven on earth, and that's what we're aiming towards. And in a way, the role of good Protestant Christians is to work towards that aim. And so a lot of this notion of progress is this, from a Buddhist perspective, we'd call a linear understanding of history. That somehow there's a beginning, Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve made a mistake, and then we're working towards then the end of history where everything will be perfect again, the Book of Genesis goals sort of thing. So there's this notion, again, something from Christianity, that progress is a good thing. Again, I won't go into details, but in Buddhist perspective, we see things as everything working in cycles. Some things get better, and then sometimes things get worse, And sometimes some things get better, and simultaneously other things get worse at the same time. And often there's a trade-off between progress in one sphere versus regression in another. I'm not going to give a strong opinion. I just say, in a way, there's this assumed notion often in secular society that we are where we are because we're a lot better than we were, and we're continuing to progress towards some sort of perfect state. Because so you could also see like a lot of the utopian ideologies that came out of 18th, 19th century Western Europe, like socialism and Marxism. Again, they take a lot of these unexamined Christian beliefs in progress and working towards some ideal, and that ideal, in a way, particularly after the millenarians who were overtly Christian, and obviously with Marx, who was overtly anti-Christian, kept the progress bit and the notion of a utopia, but instead of being a heaven on earth, became the ideal Marxist state, for example. So that was the second one. What was the third one? Oh yeah, a third assumption of secularism, which is, I think, a good one in a way from the opening question, is that all religions are faith-based. Because in a way, the assumption, because we rejected Christianity, which definitely was faith-based, I think we would argue is faith-based, and Thomas Aquinas and others would agree, it requires a leap of faith to believe in Christianity because it's inherently contradictory to our experience. But by saying, all religions should be, it's up to you what you practice, and the state and secular society can be rational, there's this sort of assumption that religion is always irrational and faith-based versus secular society, which I think is why maybe, Roy, you were hesitant about putting your hand up about being religious as a Buddhist, because Buddhism is quite a unique, I would argue, unique religion, if we call it religion, because it's not faith-based, and it's very much based on reason and experience. So in a way, you don't want to call it a religion because you get lumped into it's a religion, it's faith-based, superstitious. At the same time, though, I often find it hard to say it's not a religion because it's so much more than just, a set of beliefs like, I think it's good to exercise or, live a healthy lifestyle. It's not that either. It's something. So hence the question: are they compatible or not? It's partly maybe they are. If you limit what you believe by secularism as just rejection of religious dogma and faith-based superstition, then maybe they are compatible. But some of these other beliefs that often creep into what we think of as secular are probably not so compatible. Like I said, like belief in progress, human rights, and freedom of the individual. I'd say from a Buddhist perspective, I don't think we'd have it's not like Lord Buddha did not say, it's inherently virtuous to believe in a political system that has equal rights. It doesn't talk about that. But if we do talk about equality or equanimity in Buddhism, which is we're all equal, that we all want to be happy and we all want to be free from suffering. And in that sense, we should have empathy and love and compassion for all beings because we're all in the same boat. Humans and non-humans are equal in that sense. We all want to be happy, free from suffering, but they don't translate that into then, this is the right political system, or that's the wrong political system. And the fourth, a bit of a segue there. The fourth thing I think in secular society we often take as a truth is that science and scientific knowledge is somehow true and has a special status in the world of knowledge and truth. People often appeal to science, therefore it's true. Again, I'll talk more about this one in a bit, but from a Buddhist perspective, actually even from a Western philosophical perspective, science is a method of experimentation and hypothesis. It's not designed and it doesn't claim to be a truth about the nature of reality. It doesn't claim to be a metaphysical system. So like, for example, if you think about the scientific process, the core assumption of science is I as a scientist will position myself as the immaterial observer and I will observe observable phenomena and I will control the conditions around that phenomena. I'll use language and maths to model a hypothesis, and then I will do carefully controlled experiments to see if that hypothesis seems to agree and is consistent with the behaviors I see in the observable material world. That's the scientific praxis. But but the core assumption is self and is immaterial observer as a scientist, the external observable world. So science actually it doesn't claim to be a philosophical system of belief. It just takes self and all other subjects as the paradigm, and then works from there. So it can explain a lot about knowledge in terms of if you believe and look at the world in this conceptual paradigm or this mathematical modeling, you can predict behaviors in the external world, and that allows us to manipulate the physical world, like through electronics and everything, and rockets and everything else that we do so well. And that's great, but it's not. Scientific knowledge doesn't claim to reveal the secrets of what it is to exist and what is sentience and so on. And I'll come more to that. But there is this. So in Western philosophical circles, we often call faith in science as scientism. Mistaking of what the scientific method is, the scientific knowledge, which is all great for what it is, mistaking that as a metaphysical system that proves everything is matter. science cannot prove everything is matter, because the core scientific assumptions is this separation between the immaterial observer and the observable phenomena of which you can have an opinion on and build a scientific framework or theory on. There is no scientific proof there's only matter, for example. But the belief that it does prove that, or common belief which I was brought up with, which is everything is matter, is precisely that. It's a belief. It's a faith-based belief, because there is no basis in reason for it. Which is partly why, if you do read like Western philosophers, through to Hegel, they were often trying to prove either one way or the other. It's either things will matter and it's sort of a deterministic material world, or no, everything is mind or created by God. Like Kant and Hegel, more the idealist, everything is mind or God, and then Hume and Locke and others, everything is matter. But there was basically with Hegel, they realised words and concepts can never answer that question, and then you got postmodernism, which I won't go into in detail on this talk, but anyway. So waffling a little bit there. So that's my setup in terms of secularism, and how, of course, pure secularism, simply separation of church and state, but often being brought up in a secular society, we often assume truths, or accept certain truths as true, but they're not necessarily are true. Okay.
Well,
Yeah, Jim.
That Buddhism is like if secularism is like a Western phenomenon, is Buddhism an Eastern phenomenon, and is that the difference?
I'd say that where it came from in a way is sort of irrelevant, but it came from India and it spread across the East. But the thing is, it's just the paradigm of understanding. Buddhism is very different from anything we had in Western civilization. The understanding of what the nature of the world is quite different. So for Westerners like us, starting from a very different way of understanding the world, to get our heads around Buddhism takes a sort of a shift in belief, and a lot of the common beliefs we're brought up to believe in, which I was just explaining as sort of assumptions in a secular society, a lot of those beliefs are not consistent with a Buddhist paradigm of what we think the world is. Yeah. So we'll come more to it. But so the next topic, that's maybe a good segue, Jim, to the next topic, which is secular Buddhism. So secular Buddhism, sort of, I think Stephen Batchelor was one of the main proponents of this, starting I think in the 60s or 70s, which basically came to Buddhism. So some Westerners, came across Buddhism and said, well, some of this stuff sounds really good. We like this, it makes a lot of sense. But there's some stuff which, to me, smells of religious dogma and superstition. And so the secular Buddhist movement, in a way, was an attempt to combine secularism with Buddhism. And this, this is in a way, this was a big step to make, given that Buddhism is so new to the West, I guess. So, so these are Westerners who, brought up in a Western society and our Western beliefs and baggage, encountering Buddhism and then very quickly saying, actually, this stuff is all religious dogma. I like these bits and I'll take these bits. So what I was going to go through is some of the key assumptions of secular Buddhism, and contrast those with traditional Buddhism, and in a way that will provoke a discussion, about, okay, well, which, do you guys think is right or wrong? Or anyway, at least one way or the other, hopefully it will help you think differently about it. So the first topic, which is rejected by secular Buddhists, is the notion of rebirth. So the idea of previous and future lives. And when I came to Buddhism, that was probably the biggest topic I struggled with myself. So it's like, as a materialist, some of the philosophical stuff Buddhism says around how nothing is truly existent, and the view of emptiness, that all phenomena are impermanent and arise and cease, is a flow of dependent origination. I haven't got time to go into all the detail now, but in a way you can relate that to a materialist view, that everything is a process, everything's matter, everything is changing, nothing truly inherently exists. So some of the angles I found more easy, and so generally I think a secular Buddhist would agree largely with the view of emptiness. But then it's like, well, but then where does rebirth fit into this? That was really difficult for me. The advice I had from my main teacher, Lama Jampatai, when I asked him very early on, I don't know how I get my head around that. His response was, well, if you want to practice a path, you at least need to be at least open to the possibility of rebirth, rather than reject it outright. So the way I approach Buddhism was, okay, I'm not sure I can believe in it yet, but all right, maybe it's possible, and so on. And long story short, I guess 30-something years longer, I'm firmly have confidence in the view of rebirth. I explain more why a bit later in the talk, but anyway. But here in secular Buddhism, there's a very early rejection of rebirth as being possibly true, and the reason is, and I've watched a few videos on this to sort of get more direct view of how it's presented. But so to summarize, what I would say a secular Buddhist would argue is that, well, one, we all agree that Lord Buddha said we should be skeptical about believing things without some sort of proof. Okay, that's fine. But then it really relies a lot on science and the belief in science and scientism. So essentially, science, a secular Buddhist would often argue is, science is true. I won't go into exactly what true means right now, but generally science is true. And the science has established that everything is matter. And science has established that mental phenomena arise from material processes. So for example, you could say, well, and a Buddhist wouldn't dispute this, as I say, for example, if you had brain damage, or something happened to your brain, and it would affect your mental perceptions, your sense of you might lose your memory, your personality completely change, it could impact your ability to do, your whole world, your mental experience can be completely transformed by a material thing. So they say, well, that proves, therefore, that mental phenomena are, in effect, material processes, or at least dependent. Actually, the trick is it's dependent on material processes. And therefore, everything that we think of as mind and mental appearances are, in effect, illusory, arising from the underlying material processes of the brain and the body and so on. That would be the core thrust. And therefore, if mind only arises from the physical, then rebirth is impossible, because when your body stops working and your brain stops working, then all your thoughts and your mental experience will disappear, like that. And therefore, the belief that there's rebirth in previous or future lives is a religious dogma. That's partly what they would say. So now I was going to say maybe why a Buddhist perspective, where we would disagree with this argument. I will go through in a lot more details if we've got time later, but I do an initial response now. But then to really understand the Buddhist response, you've got to understand a bit more broadly the Buddhist philosophical view on things. So I'll come back to that in a bit. But the core crux of it from a traditional Buddhist point of view is, well, one, we agree we should be skeptical about any positions that are put forward. With regard to science, we can agree that science and scientific knowledge is very useful, and it explains what we would call, in Buddhist terms, dependent origination of material processes. There's patterns in the way that the material world works, and science is very good at observing those patterns, creating conceptual theories and mathematical models to model those patterns and how they would behave under different circumstances, and therefore was very, very useful. However, as I already alluded to, science does not make any claims about the underlying nature of reality. And what I mean by that is we're all living beings here. We have our experience of the world and our place in it, which is a very rich experience. So you have every day, every moment of the day. Science can explain maybe work as a material body and even the brain, but it doesn't attempt to say what the underlying nature of reality is. Which is why, for example, scientists can be Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim. You don't need to believe anything to make science work. So anyone can do it because it's not a belief system. It's just a way of making observations, testing hypotheses, and then you create more elaborate models of scientific theory and mathematics that help you manipulate specific types of physical phenomena. Which is why, for example, scientific theories are like incommensurable. They're like different for different purposes because they're like a tool that helps you manipulate a type of material process. So for example, which is why, from a Buddhist perspective, you say you're never going to get a unified theory of everything, because if you look at the big stuff, the theories of general relativity from Einstein explains how things work, with stars and planets and light years and things like that. And then, biology talks about it's a different conceptual paradigm. It talks about how the material body works. Our neurologists will understand, neurology explains how the brain and so on works. And then chemistry explains how the physical elements work. But each paradigm sort of stands alone in some ways. There's some connections, but there is no unified theory of everything, because each is a useful conceptual framework for manipulating a particular type of physical phenomena. Now, this is what I would say. And so the question of is everything therefore matter? Science doesn't answer that. Now, some people are trying to say, oh, yes, it can answer all that. But at the end of the day, science assumes subject and object. The whole approach, everything in the world is done by people or sentient beings. So a scientist to do observations, they can do it because they're a sentient being with awareness who can make observations. And the scientific method assumes that you're an object, there's an object and you're an immaterial perceiver perceiving that object. So that whole dichotomy of mind, matter, it can't answer it because it's just a core assumption of scientific method. And it doesn't claim to answer it if you look at science proper. So the belief then, so where does this belief come from in secular Buddhism that, well, everything's matter, science proves it's matter, therefore rebirth is not possible? Basically, we would argue, traditional Buddhist perspective is the belief that everything is matter is itself a faith-based assumption. There is no way to prove it. It's just because there is no way of proving it. And not irony, the sadness of it in a way is that conclusion, that faith-based, going from, in a way, rejecting the God view, like I'll use science and reason, but then making this great leap of faith to everything is matter, in a way relegates the whole richness of what it is to exist. I say the whole richness of being alive, and why it's so remarkable, is this luminous, limitless awareness that we're all connected to and we all experience every day. And so in a way, trying to reduce everything to this concept or idea we have, what it's just matter, in a way is completely rejects, in a way, the transcendent, you could say, and reduces everything down to the mundane material, you might say. Now, in a way, if you look at all religions, the history of religions and society, in a way, all of them have a sense of that transcendental, and they try, but we would say, misinterpret it. Hence, Christians, everything's so amazing. How could this all have come about? It must be some omnipotent, omniscient force. How is this amazingness of being alive and sentient and aware? Or there must be a soul Where did the soul come from? Well, someone omniscient being must have created it. And, so Judaism, also Christianity and Islam, sort of along those lines, and then but a lot of Hindu traditions as well have very sophisticated understandings of nature reality. But again, trying to understand the transcendent. How is it possible? Where does it come from? So this, and then some of Buddha, there was all these different views. There was also a very small Hindu sect that believed everything was matter and everything was made of atoms, even at the time of the Buddha. But it wasn't very popular. So this is just the last, let's say, 100 years, is it, of thousands of years of human history, is where we've suddenly come up with the idea everything is matter. And in a society promulgating that idea as true, and more people believing it. But essentially at its core, it's a faith-based view. Do you call it a religion? I'm not sure you call it a religion because it's so... But that's why people, Western philosophers, start calling it scientism, because it is essentially is a faith-based ideology. You see.
It's all ideology.
Yeah.
But it's inherently cannot comprehend the whole. It's just parts of the whole.
All the bits you can observe.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's the thing, is key things. So who's doing the observing? And this is why if you do more meditation and, if you practice like Buddhism, you start to examine the mind directly, and you start to say, well, what is the mind? Where is the mind? And or where's awareness, you might say. And you suddenly realize that you can't find it. It's like all pervasive and yet ungraspable. When you look directly into mind itself, there's this clarity and luminosity of our experience. So everything appears, but the awareness itself is it has no taste, it has no color, it has no shape, it has no position. It has no tangible characteristics or attributes you can hold it by or point to it or grasp it. It's just all pervasive but completely ungraspable. So anyway, that's so from a Buddhist perspective, that is sort of key to our understanding of the world, is the reality of our raw experience. So in Buddhism, you see, the way we approach being skeptical is you've also got to use your experience. And one of the things about Buddhism, which in a way we didn't have in the Western traditions, is a deep history of meditation and deep meditations to explore the nature of awareness itself. So in the West, we generally have very bright thinkers and so on, but not this sort of meditative tradition. And in Buddhism, you get direct insights through your experience, your meditation practice, and then use reason on top of that to draw conclusions. In a secular Buddhism, in a way, they've sort of jumped in with this, this assumption around everything's matter, because we sort of think science says that, and then they've rejected, in a way, one of the most core things in Buddhism, which is actually the status of awareness and mind as being so important. Okay. Hi, Joss. See it. Okay, so maybe there's a couple other aspects of secular Buddhism I wanted to talk about, and then maybe get more into the Buddhist perspective on things. So the second thing which is rejected is really karma, in terms of having any implications beyond this life, or karma having implications before this life, impinging on this life. So in a way, it obviously stems from the first one. If you reject the notion of rebirth and the notion of mind as being something, from a Buddhist perspective, actually the continuum of mind is beginningless. It's beginningless. It wasn't even a first point, because there's a continuum, it goes back infinitely. But anyway, if you reject that, then how can karma transcend or move between lives? There are no future lives. So when you die, anything you do, your karma or your actions, good and bad, they disappear. You die, your awareness disappears, so there's no consequences to your actions after this life. Similarly, for a secular Buddhist, in terms of why are we born where we are, why do things happen to us, from a secular Buddhist point of view, it's just chance, really. It's just material processes and things happen, whatever. But from a Buddhist perspective, everything that arises through prior karma, prior actions in previous lives. And in Buddhism, to get a sense of it, it's not like one previous life, it's limitless lives. So it's like, we're caught up in this beginningless chain of dependence origination. And if you think about actions, why it's such an important concept in Buddhism is partly when we act, it's always intention and then what follows in mind and body and speech. So, in a way, it's karma, I could say, certainly for our embodied state now, that brings, mind and matter together, because an action has a physical aspect, it also has a mental aspect, and it's the intention that colours the colour of our karma and the consequences of them. So anyway, so from a secular Buddhist point of view, karma is a useful principle to guide our life. Why is it true? Largely because of human psychology, and so often it would be fused with sort of Western theories of mind and psychology and so on. They generally, I think, would agree that, the negative emotions like desire, hatred, ignorance, and the others lead to negative actions, negative consequences. So if we act hatefully to people, their natural reaction is to be aggressive back to us. If we obsess about getting stuff and are never content, generally we're not going to be happy. So, so sort of they generally accede to karma, but for this life only, as it were. So from a Buddhist perspective, in opposition to that, we would say, well, we'd agree that karma is something we should live our life by, and it does have immediate consequences in this life as well as future lives. But from a Buddhist perspective, it is, why do things happen to us in this life? From a Buddhist, there's all sorts of teachings on karma and how it can transform our understanding of what happens in this life, which are so powerful, which obviously don't work if you don't believe in prior lives. So, for example, why is this person I don't even know so horrible to me? Now, if it's all about this life, well, they're a bad person. You probably want to be angry at them and someone go away and not be nice back to them. One of the ways we transform that from a Buddhist perspective is we say, well, because we're part of this continuum of mind from beginningless time. We've all had limitless lives. We've all therefore must have had limitless interactions and relationships with each other in the past. Therefore, this person who's being angry at me and being horrible to me is the ripening of my negative karma. I must have done something bad to them in a prior life. This is now naturally playing out in this life. And so, why would I be angry at them? They don't even know why they're being horrible to me. But, I must have done something bad to them, so they're just naturally reacting to me. And so what should I do in this circumstance? Actually, this person is helping me, because they're helping me purify a negative action I must have done in the past. If I can just not do anything bad back to them, then I'll purify that negative karma, and then I can move on. So suddenly you change Buddhism, the way it largely works, is you transform almost any negative action and negative experience as becoming something that, like everything is ripening my own negative karma that can therefore be purified. So in a way, in any negative situation provides an opportunity to purify negative karma and then move on. So so I guess that's, I guess I was going to attach this talk a little bit to meaning as well. I guess so. Within that framework of traditional Buddhism and prior and future lives, in a way, the meaning and of our life and the opportunities presented to us by both good and bad situations becomes like so much bigger, I guess, so much more opportunity and consequence of not doing negative actions, for example. Because the negative actions from a traditional Buddhist perspective is every time we do a negative action, we're creating a seed in our mind stream which will ripen as a negative experience in the future. So every act of aggression that we do, there's a sort of a seed sown in the ground of our mind. And in a future situation when the conditions are right, that seed will ripen as aggression and an experience where that aggression reflects back as me as the world as being aggressive to me, trying to destroy me, and then that makes me angry back to the world. So in a way that we're caught up in this beginningless patterning of mind where all our actions have consequences. And reciprocally, if we do good actions, then again, that's sowing the seed for a good experience in the future. So if we're generous with others, we're patient with others, then in a way that ripening experiences where the world seems benign towards me, is generous to me. I have all the things I need. Because that's patterning of mind, has a tendency to repeat itself. That's sort of the way that karma works. Okay, so that's the second point. So secular Buddhism rejects rebirth. It shrinks karma down to only being about this life. And then the third point then is really a related point, that the focus therefore of secular Buddhism is on how to live life well just for this life. We only live once, and so make the most of this life. And then, but they do try to combine that with karma, maybe just because more human psychology, therefore we should do good actions and avoid bad ones, because in this life, that's what will help us live a good life. So that's essentially the secular Buddhist approach. From a traditional Buddhist approach, I think we would argue whether that really is a strong basis for living a good life in this life, because someone could argue, actually, you only live once, there's no consequences to doing good or bad actions in this life when I die, so shouldn't I just maximize being happy in this life? And if that means I want to be super rich, then I'm going to devote myself to being super rich. And if I'm not happy, I'll pop some pills, and take antidepressants. Or why not just live a completely hedonistic life? If you've got the money and the situation, well, why not just experience as much pleasure as possible in this life before you die? So I think that's the thing about the YOLO mindset, is that it's not a strong basis for morality, and in a way the sort of richness of what, certainly a traditional Buddhist perspective, we think of this life and what it presents to us, the opportunity it presents to us, is lost really, and where everything is shrunk down to this limited view, which I guess is partly why, particularly I guess in the West, there's people searching for meaning generally, and why life seems can seem a bit pointless, or what's the point of everything, and things seem hollow as well. It's partly this loss of the transcendent, this notion of this bigger thing that's going on, of which we're part. Okay, so that's so that was me talking a bit about the three things secular Buddhists believe, or three things they reject from traditional Buddhism. So then I wanted to present a little bit more about the traditional Buddhist perspective on rebirth, karma, and future and past lives. So maybe I'll pause there in case there's any questions on what I covered, and then I'll start this next.
Rejection of karma.
The rejection of karma, and it's not rejection of previous past lives, which means it's all about this life. You reject rebirth 1, you reject karma in future past lives 2, and therefore the third one is a rejection that there's anything more meaningful than this life. It's all about this life, how to live a happy life in this life. It's secular Buddhism. Whereas in Buddhism, most of what we do is for future lives, not for this one. So there's a saying in Buddhism, for example, it comes to your earlier point. In the Jumpa Zijal, one of the main Sakya teachings, that said, if you have attachment to this life, you're not a spiritual person. Because even in Christianity or Judaism, nearly any other religion, there's always a focus on something bigger than this life and what will happen after we die. So, and Buddhism also agrees that it's actually what happens after this life is more important. So in Buddhist perception, there's another saying, future lives are many, whereas this life is only one, therefore future lives are more important than this one. Because we're going to have many, many future lives, and therefore we want to tame the mind and set good patterns, virtuous good patterns in our mind, around being caring for others and kindness, compassion, and not being self-obsessed and hedonistic, because that's what will propel us into our next life and the next life, and we want to set ourselves up for a good trajectory when we die. And that's what's very important for traditional Buddhism. In secular Buddhism, that's all about this life and maximizing happiness.
I have a question.
Cecilia, go on then. Go on. I'll have to say it to everyone in the
First
room.
of all, thank you so much for this amazing lecture. I always consider I actually, at the beginning when you were asking the questions about, who
Hey,
fell.
Cecilia, sorry, can you leave questions to the end? Because people in the room can't hear you either. So
I thought that you said that you were opening for questions. I'm sorry.
No, just on the bit we've done. I've still got some more talk to do. Yeah, so there's another 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for questions. Sorry. All right, cool. Sergio, you had...
Yes.
Yeah.
I have two. My first one is, I guess I would probably consider myself, growing up secular where I'm at now, but just from the conditions that I grew up in my childhood. But I guess my question is, what conditions led to the movement as a whole in Western Europe? Was it because people were fed up, or what?
Yeah, I think I tried to summarize it really badly, which is one...
Conditions bad, and then you're like,
I think that the church was very, very powerful and very, very corrupt.
Yeah.
So part of it is a rejection of that. So it's as much as a rejection of the institution of the church as it was the beliefs of the church in some ways.
Okay.
But it's a complicated topic. I'm not a historian, but that's why I say it's caught up with the Reformation as well. And but the period of philosophical thought, the Enlightenment period, where you had the rise of very great thinkers who became very influential. That's also a big part of it.
Concentration of power.
In the church.
And then who does it benefit?
Secularism.
Yes.
Well, secularism, in a way, I mean, for a Buddhist, living in a secular society in terms of having religious freedom is really good, isn't it?
That's what
Yes. Whereas if you went to if you wanted to practice Buddhism in Iran or any Muslim country, it'd be problematic because if you convert most Muslim countries, if you convert someone to Buddhism, it's punishable by death. So generally, you would not try and convert people from Islam. So in a way, living in an Islamic country versus a Western secular society, you got this. We can practice different religions. So we'd see that's a positive. Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, maybe keep going. And then when we get to 12, we can open up for more questions. But so before I come back, then traditional view on rebirth and karma and so on. There's a really important thing to understand in Buddhism, which is the distinction between ultimate and conventional truth. So ultimate versus conventional truth. So in Buddhism, it's said that. I've got a quote here from Sakya Pandita, which I'll say. So, conventional truth designates that which is perceived as existent in a non-analytical condition, and ultimate truth refers to the non-finding of any existent phenomenon in an analytical cognition. Come on, you must have followed that. All right, I'll say it once more and then I'll explain what it means. So, conventional truth designates that which is perceived as existence in a non-analytical cognition. And ultimate truth refers to the non-finding of any existence phenomenon in an analytical cognition. Okay, so I'll explain what I mean. So, conventional truth is basically truth as it relates to how the world appears to us when we don't really think too much about it. So the way it appears to us is, I exist, each of you exist, we're talking, having a nice cup of coffee, or a nice cup of coffee, and sometimes, you just live your life, and then we just accept I exist, you exist, and we do our thing. Yeah? Ultimate truth is when we start really analysing things. Well, in what way do I truly exist? So, like, if I look at my body is continually changing from moment to moment. My brain changes more quickly than anything else in my body, moment to moment. If I look at my opinions today versus what they were a year ago versus 10 years ago versus when I was a child have changed massively. My views have changed. My feelings and sensations and perceptions every day change moment to moment. So everything about my body and mind is in continual flux. And yet I have this notion that I exist. Well, I don't really think about it. But when the ultimate truth is actually when we start to analyse and look deeply into the nature of things and our own experience, there is no truly existent me, and there is no truly existent you. They're like projections, illusory projections onto our experience. So ultimate truth is everything is beyond existence, but also beyond non-existence. This is where it gets particularly tricky to get your head around. So ultimate truth is things are empty of intrinsic existence, but also empty of intrinsic non-existence. So the ultimate truth is everything in a way is flow and flux, and to then try to freeze it as existent things interacting is a projection onto what is ultimately real. So ultimate truth, so I guess the point is that ultimate truth is about how things really are, and ultimately only completely realised at enlightenment, when we become a Buddha, which will take many, many lives of practice before we achieve that realisation. So what we inhabit generally is the realm of conventional truth, how things appear to us as an ordinary sentient being. And the reason why I raise it here is that because if you think about rebirth, the idea that we have previous lives and when we have this life, then when we die, we experience rebirth of another. That is a conventional truth teaching. It's not an ultimate truth teaching. And that's a really important distinction because so when we talk about rebirth and the truth of rebirth, it's true conventionally, ultimately it's actually not true. But for us as ordinary beings, it is true because, say for example, as I just explained, I think I exist, and that's my appearance is all structured around that. When I think about it, I realise, but I'm changing all the time. Even every moment to moment, my mind, my thoughts, my feelings, my physical are changing. And yet I have this notion of I exist. From a conventional point of view, it's partly because there's this aspect of mind, the seventh consciousness, the manas consciousness, which is this grasping nature of mind. Every time you have a thought, if you do meditation and sit, that grasping, jumping nature of mind that grasps onto this feeling as real, this experience as real, my memories as real, my projection into the future of me and I want to have this thing in the future, we project this notion of a self into the future as real. So in a way, from a Buddhist perspective, this notion of rebirth isn't just life to life, it's actually happening right now, every moment, every day. We're continually reinventing ourselves, reasserting, trying to create the solidity to something which is transient and projects a sense of a self onto our experience. So rebirth as a conventional truth teaching is essentially, well, unless we cut the root cause for that illusory way of our mind appropriating, creating this illusion, unless we cut the root of that aspect of mind, it will continue at the time of our death. Mind will dissolve back into the base consciousness, but because of this impulsive, grasping, self-clinging nature of mind, it will pull itself into another experience of rebirth. Just as in from moment to moment of this life, we're continually putting ourselves into this sense of rebirth and an existence which is solid. So it's this grasping nature of mind which projects this appearance of rebirth when we die. Ultimately, we don't even exist in this life, let alone future lives. But it appears like we do, because in conventional truth, it looks like it all is solid and real.
So what's getting reborn?
Well, that's it. It's like there is nothing inherently existent that's reborn. It's just an illusory appearance of rebirth. And what shapes that experience of that rebirth is that at the time of death, all that follows us is a shadow of our actions. Because every time our actions, we're creating an imprint and a pattern in our mind stream, which is itself a continuum, and then that patterning unfolds as a rebirth according to that patterning of our mind. So it's a bit like, the analogy would be, well, an example would be if we live a life dominated by aggression towards others, we see the world as an enemy, we destroy and hurt people and so on, then likely when we die, our mind stream will be drawn into an experience where that patterning of aggression can continue. So we're born into a situation where the world is against us, the world is very aggressive towards us, maybe it's a very harsh environment, maybe we're in a desert. It's often traditionally said, in a desert and it's too hot and there's not enough water and it's hard to survive. And so the aggression that we cultivate in life is then reflected back in the experience we have in a rebirth. But there's nothing. So we call it a mind stream, just as in, like Heraclitus said, you never step into the same stream twice. The stream is continually changing. You never step into the same stream twice. But so the mind stream is a bit like that. It's continually changing. So you can't say there's anything solid which is reborn, but we have the appearance of being reborn, and the patterning will continue from our actions, our karma.
Well, can you fold that in with the idea of living in the present moment?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, that in a way, if we could completely live in the present moment, we would be an enlightened being. Because we would have cut through that grasping, self-clinging nature of mind, and so we would be completely grounded in the present. And that experience, which we call enlightenment, is what a Buddha experiences. And from a traditional Buddhist perspective, and certainly in our tradition, we see that then as the unfolding, the removing of any limitation then on the activity for others. So we would see enlightenment where you're completely grounded in the present, then releases the spontaneous, limitless activity for the benefit of others, which is what a Buddha does. But in a way, that's the goal of all Buddhism, in a way, is to ground us completely in the present. So, for example, meditations on death, certainty of death, uncertainty of time of death, and what will help us at the time of death. Partly that helps us ground back in today, in the present, because why are we always worrying about stuff I'm going to do next week, or things I'm worried about where I want to be so I can retire in X years' time? You don't know you're ever going to get there. You only know now. So I see even meditations on impermanence and death, or meditation on karma, they're all about grounding us back into the present and making use of the present now. What will help us in the present? Do good actions, avoid negative actions, develop insights into the nature of mind.
So if there's a goal, it's just to be present without the sense of self in the moment.
Yes, that's the ultimate goal, but at the same time, as I alluded to, when you grounded in the present, it's because in the ultimate sense, not just mean we're having a good day, but in the ultimate sense of becoming completely enlightened, we've removed all obscurations to what we call the Buddha nature, the true nature of our mind, the Buddha nature. And the way we think of it is the Buddha nature is already endowed with limitless compassion, wisdom, and power to benefit others. So in a way, by achieving that goal of groundedness, complete groundedness in the present, and cutting off all self-clinging, then that limitless compassion, power, and wisdom will manifest for the benefit of others, and we will spontaneously act for the benefit of others, because there's no self-clinging left. And that's the goal, enlightenment. Sorry?
Just being will benefit others.
No, well, we will naturally, spontaneously want to do things for others as well. It's not just passive. It will be active.
But our presence will benefit others.
The presence would also benefit others. Like in the same way that, we all influence each other, isn't it? And it's sometimes said that, like, the analogy of the Buddha was like an enlightened being is like the sandalwood tree. You know, sandalwood is a tree and wood that smells very nice. So imagine a sandalwood tree in the forest surrounded by other trees. The scent of the sandalwood tree will naturally affect and be absorbed by the trees around it without the sandalwood tree having to do anything. So in that sense, yeah, it benefit others through enlightenment. Right, I've got to admit, I've only got less than 10 minutes left. So let me wrap up and then take more questions, and we can chat at the end. So I just explained the view of conventional truth, ultimate truth. I also explained a little bit about ultimate truth being the view that everything is empty of intrinsic nature or intrinsic existence and non-existence. So why I wanted to do that partly is then, so from a Buddhist perspective, traditional Buddhist perspective, every non-Buddhist view you can categorize as two types of view, what we call the two extremes. There's eternalist views and annihilationist views. I often call annihilationist views nihilist, just for short, but so eternalism and nihilism. So eternalism are views that cling to something truly exists. So for example, belief in a omniscient God, you know, all those religions, they're eternalist views. So from a Buddhist perspective, what's going on there is that, you know, I talked a lot about patterning. You know, our actions have consequences, and you know, we can see we affect each other. There's some sort of continuum. There's some sort of continuity embedded in this ever-changing world. So we say eternalists, like theists, like Christians and so on, in a way they're mistaking that continuity with existence, and then over-exaggerating what is really the patterning of dependent origination, how everything rises and causes conditions and a sort of flow like a stream. They're mistaking that for thinking there's something really, there must be something solid behind it. And so they suppose an omniscient, unchanging God, and they suppose we have unchanging souls within us, and so on. So this eternalism is sort of over-exaggerating that continuity that we can see in the patterning of how things work. Annihilationists, or nihilism, is where they deny future and past lives and the connection between them. So, you know, this idea that everything is matter, okay, I can concede it looks like I exist now and it seems like there's a mind, but it's not really. And when I die, it will just be a blankness. That is a nihilist view, because it denies any consequences to our actions, and it denies any reality to consciousness, to awareness. So from a Buddhist perspective, those are the two extremes. And nihilism, in a way, what's happening there, you know, there's a certain intelligence behind nihilism, which is recognizing everything is changing. There's nothing the same, even for a moment, which I mentioned before, the view of emptiness, well, it seems pretty similar, because we say nothing truly exists moment to moment. And but by denying any respect, as it were, to the world of appearance, to conventional truth, yeah, maybe things don't truly exist, but they look like they do. Like for all of us, it seems like I really do exist. And so as I approach death or whatever, I'm going to be pretty upset probably about it or worried when it actually happens. And so but they're falling into this nihilism, over exaggerating the fact that nothing truly exists, and then end up in this nihilist position, therefore, where our actions don't really matter, but they do matter because of conventional truth. Yeah, ultimately maybe nothing truly exists, but the way it appears to us and the way it will appear to us now, and as we approach our death and at death itself, we won't be able to let go of that grasping nature of mind, and that will propel us into another rebirth and then into another rebirth, and we're caught in this cycle of endless birth, sickness, old age, and death. So yeah, eternalism and nihilism, in a way, what we call the two extreme views, which are mistaken understanding of the true nature of reality itself, which is the Buddhist understanding of the view of emptiness. So in a way, I've explained, therefore, rebirth, you know, in a way, so from a traditional Buddhist perspective, yes, it's not an ultimate truth, but from a conventional truth point of view, rebirth is something we've experienced and we will continue to experience unless we achieve enlightenment and see things for what they really are. So then in terms of karma, cause and effect, again, I alluded to it already, therefore that's why actions work. It's a conventional truth phenomena. All our actions have consequences, and the consequences will be coloured by the intention of the original action. So actions driven by desire, aggression, ignorance, or the other, or things like pride and jealousy, or resentment, or laziness, or these other different disturbing emotions, they will create negative experiences in the future when those seeds ripen. And the converse, if the more we do positive actions, they will sow the seeds for good experiences in future lives and so on. So for a traditional Buddhist, that's why Lord Buddha, the first thing he taught was generosity. Because even if people don't believe in Buddhism and not Buddhists, we would always encourage people to do good actions. And that was what the first thing Lord Buddha said, because whether they believe in Buddhism or not, good actions will have good consequences. So in a way, any view in a way that encourages good actions, therefore from a Buddhist perspective, we can still say is a good thing. So if in Christianity they encourage people to do not to kill and not to steal and do good actions, that's a good thing. If a humanist, so nominally annihilationist, but they believe actually for humanistic reasons we create our moral code and it's good therefore to do good things. If it makes them do good things, then it's still a good thing. They do good things because karma, every action does have consequences, and therefore we should do as much good things and avoid as negative things. And then lastly, then that notion in secular Buddhism that therefore everything should be about this life. As I said, for a traditional Buddhist, no, this life is important, but future lives are far more important because there's lots more of them. And therefore, the importance of our actions should be magnified, and we should take even more care in trying to do good things and avoid negative things. And ultimately, that's also why we'd want to practice meditation and develop insight into the nature of mind, because ultimately, from a Buddhist perspective, we're trying to break out of the cycle of suffering completely, which is enlightenment itself, and also then from a Mahayana perspective, also that gives us the power then to be able to free all other beings from the cycle of birth and death as well. So that was that's the end of the talk, and I think we just hit 12 o'clock. But happy to we can talk more and discuss any questions people have.